In the world we know, the Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, were defeated in 1945 after 6 years of global conflict. But history is never inevitable. Small moments, different decisions, or simple chance can change the course of everything. In this alternate timeline, Germany did not lose the Second World War, it won. The key turning point came in 1941. Instead of overextending into the brutal Russian winter and stalling outside Moscow, Hitler made a different decision. His generals were allowed to act with greater autonomy, and German forces focused their assault more narrowly on capturing Soviet logistical centers. The Blitzkrieg campaign in the East continued with fewer delays, and Stalin's strategic miscalculations, already disastrous, became fatal. The Soviet Union collapsed in late 1942 after a string of devastating defeats and mass desertions. Stalin was either killed or exiled. Accounts would vary. With the Eastern Front no longer absorbing vast resources, the German military redirected its power westward. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was revised and launched in 1943 with the full might of the Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, and an invasion force supported by the newly conquered Soviet oil fields. Britain, exhausted from years of bombing, now isolated without the prospect of American military support, was eventually forced into an armistice. Winston Churchill was removed from power by political rivals advocating for peace, and a puppet government sympathetic to Berlin was established. Meanwhile, the United States remained focused on the Pacific theater. The attack on Pearl Harbor still happened, and the war with Japan consumed American attention. Without a major ground war in Europe, and with Britain neutralized, there was no D-Day invasion. Roosevelt's ambitions for liberating Europe were halted by Congress, and domestic pressure turned inward toward rebuilding and isolation. By 1945, Germany had achieved domination over mainland Europe. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, the Balkans, and much of Eastern Europe became part of the Greater Germanic Reich, either through direct occupation or compliant satellite regimes. Italy remained nominally independent, but increasingly subordinate to German authority. Spain under Franco offered passive support and territorial neutrality. The Third Reich implemented a systematic restructuring of the continent. Resistance movements were crushed, dissidents purged, and national cultures slowly eroded under the weight of Germanization policies. High German became the administrative language of Europe. Education systems were overhauled to reflect Nazi ideology, and historical narratives were rewritten to portray the Axis as liberators from communism and Western decay. Berlin was renamed Germania and reconstructed according to Hitler's architectural ambitions: massive neoclassical monuments, vast boulevards, and a domed central hall to rival the Roman Pantheon. German technological development surged, fed by resources from across the continent and bolstered by scientific talent captured or co-opted from occupied countries. Nuclear research continued in secret, with German scientists eventually achieving their first test of an atomic bomb by the early 1950s. Racial policies remained central to the regime. The Holocaust was not stopped, but expanded. In the absence of Allied liberation, millions more perished in camps spread across Eastern Europe. The Slavic populations of the East were gradually enslaved or displaced to make room for German settlers in a decades-long campaign known as the General Plan Ost. The idea of a master race was no longer just rhetoric, it was state doctrine, ruthlessly applied. The political system of the Reich transformed over time. With military victory secured, Hitler withdrew from public life by the late 1940s, handing increasing authority to his inner circle. Heinrich Himmler and Albert Speer became the dominant figures in civilian governance. The SS evolved from a paramilitary force into a bureaucratic machine overseeing surveillance, education, and ideological enforcement. Europe became a continent of quiet conformity, where opposition was invisible and fear was institutional. By the early 1960s, Germany stood not only as a military superpower, but as the dominant cultural and economic force of the Western world. The United States remained powerful but diplomatically cautious, locked in a cold and uneasy standoff with the Reich. Japan controlled much of East Asia, but Germany's influence extended from Lisbon to Kiev, from Oslo to Athens. A new world order had taken shape, stable but built on repression. This was not peace in the traditional sense. It was the absence of open conflict, enforced through surveillance, propaganda, and the systematic elimination of difference. The cost of order was freedom, and the price of unity was truth. By the early 1960s, daily life within the Greater Germanic Reich had settled into a rhythm, controlled, structured, and uniform. Across occupied and annexed territories, from Amsterdam to Prague, Paris to Warsaw, a single system governed how people lived, worked, and thought. Children grew up in schools where history had been rewritten. They no longer learned about the Allied landings in Normandy or the fall of Berlin. Instead, they were taught that Germany had liberated Europe from chaos, that Bolshevism was a disease, Western liberalism a weakness, and the Reich the sole guardian of civilization. Textbooks glorified German victories and heroes, from Frederick the Great to Hitler himself, whose image hung in every classroom, surrounded by banners and symbols. The educational system emphasized obedience, racial purity, and order. Children were enrolled in state youth organizations like the Hitlerjugend Europa or its local equivalents. Uniforms were worn with pride. Physical fitness, marching drills, and ideological lessons shaped young minds. Questioning authority was discouraged. Curiosity was carefully filtered. At home, families lived under quiet pressure. German culture was heavily promoted and often mandated. In Dutch or French households, newspapers and radio stations were state-approved and German language preferred. Classical music filled the airwaves, Wagner, Bruckner, Beethoven, while jazz, swing, and foreign pop were banned as degenerate. Film and television depicted heroic German soldiers, loyal Aryan families, and victories against imagined traitors. Housing followed standardized design, inspired by neoclassical and modernist architecture, stripped of ornament and designed for utility. Urban centers were redesigned with imposing facades, massive plazas, and government buildings meant to instill awe. Berlin, now known as Germania, stood as the capital of this new order, its streets lined with columns, statues, and wide ceremonial boulevards. Religious institutions still existed, but under heavy regulation. Churches could operate, but sermons were monitored, and dissenting clergy were quietly removed. The state promoted a distorted form of Christianity that aligned with its racial and nationalist values. In some regions, especially Eastern Europe, traditional faiths were suppressed altogether. The surveillance state was all encompassing. In every neighborhood, someone was listening. Informants blended into everyday life. A coworker, a teacher, a friend. People learned to be cautious with words, to speak in generalities, to avoid political conversations, even within their own families. Fear became instinct. The Gestapo and the SS no longer needed open violence. They had perfected silent control. Censorship extended into art, science, and language. Modernist painters, dissident writers, and unapproved intellectuals had disappeared, some into exile, most into silence. Bookshelves were curated by the Ministry of Culture. Literature that emphasized individual freedom, equality, or critical thinking was forbidden. In its place, shelves were filled with heroic realism, epic stories of sacrifice, obedience, and triumph. Travel within the Reich was allowed, but tightly monitored. Internal passports documented movement, and foreign travel was rare. Most people stayed within familiar cities, where order was visible. Police were ever present but polite. Streets were clean. Crime was low. Trains ran on time. Bread was affordable. To many, especially younger generations, this world seemed normal, even prosperous. But beneath the surface, tension lingered. Ethnic minorities, especially Jews, Roma, and Slavs, had vanished from public life, resettled, deported, or worse. Official records were vague. Whispers remained. In cities like Warsaw or Kiev, whole neighborhoods had disappeared. People learned not to ask why. Memorials did not exist. History had been edited. Technology advanced at a steady pace. Germany invested heavily in industrial automation, computing, and early space research. The first German satellite was launched in 1961 from a facility in Ukraine. There were rumors of a manned lunar program competing quietly with American and Japanese efforts. Scientific progress was encouraged, but always under state control. Independent research, particularly in philosophy, political theory, or genetics, was suppressed or redirected. Every home had a radio tuned to Reichsrundfunk, the central broadcasting network. News bulletins began with martial music and ended with reports on agricultural output, military parades, or loyalty oaths. The tone was always calm, always optimistic. Words like progress, purity, and stability were constant. There were no headlines about crime, no reports of resistance, only unity. Still, small acts of quiet rebellion persisted. Illegal books passed hand to hand. Secret radios picked up foreign broadcasts from Sweden, Switzerland, or the U.S. underground networks existed, though carefully, cautiously. A look, a poem, a coded phrase. These were the seeds of opposition. But fear often outweighed courage. Most people adapted. They survived by staying invisible. In the end, the Reich didn't rely only on force. It relied on fatigue. After decades of war, many chose peace, even if it was built on silence. Comfort, routine, and predictability became virtues. The state didn't need to convince everyone. It only needed them to stop caring. By the mid-1960s, a new generation had grown up having never known another world. They had never seen democracy, or free speech, or open debate. Their Europe was one of symmetry, control, and banners waving in silence. What had once been conquest had become daily life. By the late 1960s, the Greater Germanic Reich stood as the dominant force in Europe. Its borders stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ural Mountains, and from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. But beyond these borders, the world had not stood still. Germany's victory had set in motion a new geopolitical balance, a fragile, calculated equilibrium where superpowers no longer competed in ideology alone, but in influence, intimidation, and silent rivalry. The United States remained a global power, but one whose ambitions had shifted inward. Without the moral justification of liberating Europe, American leaders after Roosevelt pursued a more isolationist path. The war in the Pacific against Japan had consumed enormous resources, and even with victory there, the psychological toll of a divided world was deep. Washington no longer spoke of spreading democracy. Instead, it spoke of preserving national interest, maintaining military strength, and guarding its hemisphere. The American public, disillusioned by its inability to intervene in Europe, became more insular. Foreign aid dwindled, military alliances faded. The Marshall Plan, NATO, the United Nations, all of it had never happened. By contrast, Germany promoted itself not only as a continental ruler, but as a civilizational model. Its leadership exported technology, culture, and ideology to satellite states across the world. Latin American regimes that once flirted with fascism welcomed German advisors and industrial investments. In Africa, colonial systems were restructured under German economic dominance, with native populations subjected to rigid racial hierarchies disguised as stability programs. German companies operated mines, railroads, and administrative centers across the continent. In Asia, the Japanese Empire reigned over a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. China had been partitioned between Japanese puppet states and warlords, with Germany formally recognizing Japanese control over the region in exchange for maritime neutrality. There was no tension between Berlin and Tokyo, only distance. The two empires divided the world like merchants agreeing on markets. Their spheres did not overlap. There was no need for confrontation. India, meanwhile, remained under British colonial control longer than in our timeline, as the United Kingdom, now a client state of Germany, lacked both the will and international support to manage its empire's decline. Independence came eventually, but under different circumstances and with less global attention. The Soviet Union no longer existed. After its collapse, Eastern Europe had been reorganized under a mix of direct German rule and client regimes. Russia was carved into administrative zones governed by German officials and loyal local elites. Moscow was no longer a political capital, but a cultural backwater under strict surveillance. The idea of pan-Slavic unity had been crushed. In its place stood division, fear, and German economic dominance. There was no Cold War. There were no proxy conflicts in Korea or Vietnam. Instead, the world existed in a quiet, uneasy order. Technology advanced, but often in secret. Nations no longer competed openly in ideology, but rather in capability: missiles, nuclear weapons, espionage, and industrial control. German rocket programs tested the boundaries of space. American satellites watched from above. But no side dared provoke war again. The memory of global conflict remained raw. International borders were more fixed than ever. Immigration was heavily restricted. Air travel was controlled. Tourism became an activity reserved for loyal citizens of the Reich or elite allies. Global communication remained limited, censored, and monitored. The idea of a connected, globalized world had not taken root. Information, too, moved differently. While America developed early computing networks and television broadcasting, Germany centralized information into rigid state systems. Knowledge was controlled. History, even outside Europe, was rewritten in favor of German narratives. Museums in South America depicted the Axis as misunderstood peace bringers. Textbooks in parts of Africa omitted the Holocaust entirely. Memory had become negotiable, flexible under the right authority. Culturally, the divide grew deeper. In Reich territory, art and literature were strictly managed. Modernism was labeled as decadent. Film remained nationalistic, with grand historical epics and military dramas dominating cinemas. German artists, who conformed to state expectations, thrived. Those who didn't were silenced, or worse, forgotten. In contrast, the United States saw an explosion of countercultural movements. The 1960s brought civil rights protests, anti-fascist literature, experimental music, and underground films that critiqued authority, conformity, and historical myth. But these ideas rarely crossed into Reich territory. When they did, it was through illegal broadcasts or black market recordings, quietly shared among youth and university circles. Diplomatic relations between the Reich and the U.S. were tense but formal. Embassies existed in Berlin and Washington. Trade negotiations occurred in carefully scripted meetings. Intelligence agencies on both sides operated in shadows, funding dissidents, bribing officials, intercepting communications. It was not a war of bullets, but of silence, signals, and secrets. And through it all, the world held its breath. In the public squares of Berlin, flags waved in perfect symmetry. In the skyscrapers of New York, news tickers buzzed with controlled optimism. On the streets of Cairo, Rio, Delhi, and Johannesburg, people wondered what history might have been if it had turned out differently still. But in this version of reality, one truth was undeniable. The world had not been made free. It had simply been divided, ordered, and enclosed by those who had won and those who had failed to stop them. The Reich did not merely conquer territory. It sought to engineer the future. Victory in the Second World War had given Nazi Germany the power to reshape not only maps and governments, but the very trajectory of science, technology, and cultural expression. In the decades that followed, scientific advancement within the Reich was dramatic, but carefully directed. The state funded large-scale research initiatives in rocketry, computing, chemistry, and genetics. But these fields were not free. They served the goals of the regime. German rocket science advanced swiftly under the leadership of engineers like Werner von Braun, who in this timeline remained in Germany rather than emigrating to the United States. By the early 1960s, the Reich had launched satellites into low Earth orbit. These missions were not public spectacles like the American space program. They were quiet demonstrations of dominance, with launches conducted from isolated sites in occupied Ukraine or Norway, monitored only by Reich scientists and military officials. The first German astronaut, Weltraumfahrer as the regime called him, entered orbit in 1965. There was no global announcement, no television broadcast, only a carefully worded article in a state newspaper. German science leads humanity beyond Earth. The mission's true details remained classified. Whether he returned safely was never confirmed. Artificial intelligence and computing, still in their infancy, were used primarily for military and surveillance purposes. Massive analog computers, developed in secret by state-funded universities, aided in code breaking, targeting, and census tracking. Civilian applications were limited as the regime feared uncontrolled access to data or communication. There were no personal computers, no open internet, only centralized systems tied directly to the Ministry of Information. Medical science also progressed, but within a deeply unethical framework. Human experimentation, banned in much of the world, continued in hidden facilities. Prisoners from Eastern Europe and political dissidents were subjected to brutal trials, hypothermia exposure, altitude tests, chemical injections, all in pursuit of data that would benefit the Reich's military and elite. Official records referred to these programs with sanitized terms like special medical advancement zones. Genetics became a core area of investment. Nazi ideology had always promoted the idea of racial purity, and with victory secured, the regime set out to perfect the German population. Eugenics programs, halted in our world, expanded. Families were required to submit genetic profiles before marriage. Children deemed genetically inferior were quietly institutionalized or sterilized. Propaganda celebrated the ideal Aryan appearance: blonde, tall, symmetrical. Over time, regional diversity faded, replaced by homogenized features, modeled after a state-mandated aesthetic. Outside the realm of science, culture became a tightly controlled instrument. Art, music, film, and literature were judged not by their creativity, but by their conformity to state ideals. Modernist art was condemned as chaotic and Jewish. Abstract expressionism, surrealism, and jazz were all banned. In their place rose a genre called heroische aesthetic, heroic aesthetics, celebrating discipline, strength, and order. Painters were state employees, commissioned to depict military victories, agricultural bounty, and serene Aryan families in pastoral settings. Sculptors crafted stone figures of idealized soldiers and mothers. Film studios produced historical epics centered on German triumphs, no longer just during the war, but throughout all of history. The rise of the Reich was portrayed as the inevitable culmination of Western civilization. Music followed strict guidelines. Composers wrote stirring orchestral pieces, reminiscent of Wagner and Bruckner. Dissonance was discouraged. Melody, structure, and rhythm were expected to reflect the harmony of the state. Foreign influences were purged. Folk music was preserved but reframed as evidence of ancient Germanic roots. Literature faced perhaps the greatest transformation. Books were censored before publication. Poets who questioned state narratives vanished from bookstores and public memory. Historical fiction was limited to retellings of German heroism. Philosophy returned to rigid idealism, with thinkers like Hegel and Nietzsche repurposed to justify authoritarianism, stripped of nuance, reduced to slogans. In education, creativity was not encouraged. Memorization, obedience, and ideological alignment defined the classroom. Scientific innovation existed, but only within approved boundaries. Students were taught to think logically, but never critically. Ethics was replaced by duty, morality by loyalty. Yet even in this tightly engineered society, cracks began to form. In the underground clubs of Vienna, young musicians recorded illegal jazz tapes. In Paris, secret reading circles discussed banned foreign authors. In Prague, students printed leaflets questioning the regime's version of history. These movements were small and scattered and dangerous, but they signaled that total control was never absolute. Outside the Reich, cultural life evolved differently. In the United States, freed from the burden of war in Europe, the arts flourished. Abstract art, experimental film, science fiction, and protest music exploded in popularity. America became a hub for exiled intellectuals, artists, and scientists who had fled the continent after the Axis victory. This cultural contrast widened over time. While German cities remained coldly beautiful and immaculately ordered, they lacked spontaneity. Creativity, so closely tied to freedom, had been replaced by replication. Architecture was grand but soulless. Literature was noble but empty. Film was perfect but predictable. By the 1970s, technological parity between the Reich and the United States remained close, but the philosophical gap had grown immense. The West increasingly valued personal expression and ethical debate. The Reich valued silence, order, and control. And so, even without a Cold War, the world remained divided just by values rather than ideologies, by how progress was defined and who was allowed to shape it. Germany had won the war, but in doing so, it had lost the ability to imagine a world beyond itself. The year is 2001. More than half a century has passed since Germany secured its victory in the Second World War. The world is no longer at war, but peace, in the true sense, remains elusive. The Greater Germanic Reich still dominates Europe, not through open violence, but through silence, fear, and institutionalized obedience. Yet beneath this surface of stability, history begins to stir. Generations have come and gone. Children raised on state propaganda have become adults, then parents, and now elders. But in the information age, one the Reich has long resisted, seeds of doubt grow stronger. Satellite television signals leak across borders. Hidden hard drives circulate between students. Illegally imported novels, films, and music from the outside world find quiet audiences in cafes and university dorms. In Berlin, still called Germania, young people speak in hushed voices about alternate timelines. In underground clubs, artists paint strange, dreamlike scenes forbidden by the Ministry of Culture. In Warsaw, whispered conversations compare official history books with smuggled ones. In Paris, a philosophy professor is quietly arrested for questioning whether the Holocaust had, in fact, happened and why it was never publicly discussed. For decades, the Holocaust has remained the greatest unspoken truth of the Reich. Entire cities, communities, and peoples vanished in the 1940s, and official records were altered or destroyed. In this version of the world, there were no war crimes trials, no international tribunals, no memory culture. But memory is stubborn, and now, as scattered documents reappear, old letters, photographs, testimonies, truth begins to return. Even within the ranks of power, divisions emerge. Hardline ideologues push for renewed purges of dissidents and stricter media control. But younger officials, those who grew up after the wars, begin to doubt. Some quietly advocate for reform, transparency, even the possibility of elections. They are few and careful, but they exist. Outside the Reich, the world has changed rapidly. The United States and Japan, still economic and technological superpowers, have become centers of global information exchange. The internet, long confined to closed military or academic systems within the Reich, is now openly available elsewhere. Video footage, just recordings, and independent journalism from the rest of the world offer glimpses of a freer, more chaotic life. Global culture celebrates diversity, creativity, and confrontation. In the Reich, where the state once praised harmony and uniformity, younger generations begin to find those values hollow. A protest movement grows, not on the streets, where police still patrol with near total authority, but in hearts and homes. Through quiet refusal, through art, through ideas, some signs of change become visible. In 1999, a statue of Hitler, erected 50 years earlier in the center of Germania, is quietly removed for restoration. It is never returned. In 2000, the first semi-public debate is held in Vienna over the ethics of state censorship. In 2001, for the first time in Reich history, a teacher in Munich is formally reprimanded, but not imprisoned, for showing students a banned film from the United States. Outside observers are cautious. Some fear that the Reich will tighten its grip again. Others hope that change, long delayed, may now be irreversible. Yet one truth remains: authoritarian systems do not collapse overnight. They erode slowly from within. The Reich was not built in a day, and it will not fall in one. But the cracks are real. The silence is no longer complete. The fear no longer absolute. The people of the Reich live in a world built on control, but their dreams are harder to police. And what of history? In this alternate world, history is a battlefield not of armies, but of narratives. The Reich controls textbooks, museums, monuments, but in basements and attics, boxes of letters and photos survive. Across Europe, families pass down whispered truths that contradict the official record. In Prague, an old man tells his granddaughter about the resistance. In Oslo, a librarian keeps a hidden shelf of forbidden poetry. In Budapest, a historian risks everything to scan a journal from a Jewish family lost in 1943. Truth, once buried, begins to breathe. By 2001, the Reich remains powerful, but its grip is no longer eternal. Information spreads faster than ideology. Technology undermines isolation, and memory, once fractured, begins to mend. The world is not free, not yet, but it is changing. And in that change lies the final paradox of this imagined history, that even in a world where darkness won, light finds its way back in.